So I just read something really interesting. It is from Harry Elmer Barne's tome, An Intellectual and Cultural History of the Western World, which is in the public domain, and it's from the chapter on Contemporary Civilizations and the Future, A Glimpse into the Future, Section 6, The Historical and Institutional Setting of the Second World War, the Fourth Great World Revolution. Fundamental to any intelligent discussion on the Second World War is the obvious fact that this is not a war which can be understood or described within the old and conventional patterns of campaigns, battles, and dynastic ambitions. Oh, and I should note that this was written during World War II. To an even greater extent than the First World War, it is a phase or aspect of sweeping and institutional changes. In this way, it resembles the wars which created the great monarchies of the ancient Near East, Egypt and Assyria, the wars which hastened the breakup of the Roman Empire in the West, and the wars which, in early modern times, wiped out feudalism and created the great national states of Western Europe. We are already well advanced in a vast revolutionary movement, which, in a way, was ushered in by the First World War. The Second World War is bringing matters to a head and is greatly stepping up the tempo of social change. The tremendous institutional changes which are now upon us will continue, no matter which side wins in the current strife. The victory of one side or the other may bring about quite different results and details, but such differences in the outcome will be quite incidental to the profound cultural transformations of which the present war is only one manifestation. Civilization as we knew it at the opening of the 20th century is doomed. Whether the British or the Nazis win, we will almost certainly enjoy a better civilization in the event of a British victory, but it will not be the same civilization we have known in contemporary times. Therefore, to have any true understanding of the Second World War, we cannot regard it as a selfish plot of the Tory moneybags in England to hold on to their ancient ill-gotten gains, or even merely as the effort of the upstart Nazi militarists to overrun Western Europe. We must comprehend the fact that we are living in the fourth great transitional period of mankind on this planet, a transition comparable only to the dawn of history in the ancient Orient, the breakdown of ancient pagan imperialism with the decline of the Western Roman Empire, and the downfall of medievalism between the days of Columbus and Napoleon. Today, our modern institutions are passing through the same strains, stresses, and changes as were the manorial system, feudalism, and the guilds between 1400 and 1800s. Totalitarianism now menaces capitalism, representing government and democracy in much the same way that the Tudors, Bourbons, and merchant capitalists challenged feudalism in early modern times. Had a scholar suggested in the year 1400 that the civilization of his age was on the eve of a thoroughgoing transformation, he would have been ignored or ridiculed. Yet just this thing happened. By 1800, medieval civilization had ceased to exist, except in the more backward parts of Europe. So likewise, we in the second third of the 20th century find it hard to believe that we may be in about the same general cultural and institutional situation in which the Western world found itself around 1400. Yet plenty of evidence may be found to support the opinion that we have already instituted more far-reaching changes than any previous century ever witnessed, perhaps the most fundamental transition in man's experience on this planet. The typical modern institutions, nationalism, representative government, democracy, capitalism, liberal education, and supernatural religion may be approaching the same period of disruption which feudalism, the manor, the guilds, and scholasticism exhibited around the year 1400. It is a certainty that the institutions and culture of the year 2000 or even 1975 will differ widely from those of our day. There is considerable prospect that the contrast will be fully as great as that between the civilization of the early Tudor period and European culture in the days of Napoleon. While in a broad and general way, our age resembles the three previous eras of sweeping social and cultural transition. There are at least two important contrasts between former transitional epochs and our own. In the first place, it is inevitable that the changes which lie ahead of us, for better or for worse, must be carried through far more rapidly than in the past. Again, it is inevitable that the changes which lie ahead of us, for better or worse, must be carried through far more rapidly than in the past. This is indeed true. It's almost like a singularity of historical changes going on, especially now, these days. I mean, and he's talking about, during World War II, and it's just, we've seen this to be the case. In some ways, it's a pretty obvious fact, and in some ways, it's, in history class, we kind of think, oh, time is all, all times are kind of the same, and yet these times, due to technology and cultures, meeting, and all kinds of things going on, the speed of change is increasing rapidly. Anyway, back to it. So, the simple pastoral and agricultural civilizations of earlier ages could keep on going in one way or another for a long time under adverse conditions. Except for war, invasion, and devastation, a complete breakdown was unlikely. There might be less dried beef, flour, and meal for the larder, and less fodder for the cattle. A more than usual number of babies, old people, calves, and sheep might die of malnutrition. The standard of living might be lowered in the few towns that continued to exist. Yet somehow mankind could manage to get along. It required several thousand years to bring about the transition from tribal culture to the civilization of ancient Egypt and Babylonia. Scores of causes for the decline of Roman society have been suggested by historians. But, despite all these causes, it took 5 centuries from Diocletian to Charlemagne to wreck Roman civilization. Even when conditions were improving in the past, it required a long time to create a new order. The decay of medieval institutions actually began in the late 13th century, but the early modern age was hardly complete before 1800. We moderns will have no such extended period for readjustment. Our urban industrial world civilization presents an altogether different spectacle. Our culture is so dynamic and complex, so delicately articulated, so thoroughly based upon an elaborate division of labor that the whole system must work efficiently if it is to work at all. It may be compared to an automobile which, if defective in a single vital part, the carburetor, distributor, or battery, and efficient in all other parts, will not run at all. That's a really good metaphor. Let me repeat that. So similar to society today. If one thing goes wrong, it can be disastrous to the entire society. And the metaphor is this, which I'll repeat. It may be compared to an automobile, which, if defective in a single vital part, the carburetor, distributor, or battery, and efficient in all other parts, will not run at all. An illustration of this fact was furnished by the bank holiday in the opening days of Mr. Roosevelt's first administration. Our industrial system was still operating, transportation lines ran as before, food supplies were not curtailed, electric current was generated in normal volume, and so on. There was merely a temporary suspension of the ordinary credit system and medium of exchange. Yet the country was in a veritable panic. Had not a new and colorful administration been installed to give renewed hope and confidence, there is no telling how serious a breakdown of the whole structure of capitalist society might have ensued. We can easily imagine what would happen if basic industries, electric power service, transportation, or food production was entirely disrupted. And believe it or not, these are things gravely in threat today. We have supply chain crises. We have everything being based on power these days. I don't know if anyone follows Suspicious Observers. I recommend the channel on YouTube. But we are entering an era in which solar flares and sun activity is going to become more of a possibility that we have a solar flare as sun activity is increasing. Furthermore, we're actually due for a pole shift. The the North Pole has been drifting. I mean, it's no longer at the North, what used to be the North Pole, and the magnetic field is weakening. And ultimately so weakening magnetic field and increased sun activity, to stay on point, because I can go on about this, means the advent of a solar flare taking out technology and taking out power and taking out all things dependent on electricity is entirely possible. In fact, more likely than not to happen by 2050. It's a high probability that this is going to happen. In fact, it did happen, I believe in the early 1800s, and it fried the entire telegraph system. All the wires were fried and everything. And that's when we had a stronger magnetic field. It's been decreasing rapidly. I mean, it's like, I can't remember exactly, so I don't want to say, but somewhere around 50% weaker than like 300 years ago. I could be wrong about this. Check out Suspicious Observers. He's gaining traction, and he's being shown to be right, especially on climate change. We're not. There's no global warming happening. It's actually global cooling is what's going to happen. But before that, probably much worse. Just check out Suspicious Observers to find out about that. And that's just one aspect. And then we have our supply chains breaking down, which almost seems to kind of be organized and manipulated like a manufactured crisis. And then we also have the agricultural system being messed with, essentially. Like, they're killing animals because they keep saying, they have these certain diseases based on one person having them. And here I recommend following Ice Age Farmer. He can tell you all about the stuff going on and the horrible stuff going on with farming right now, and poor farmers losing their jobs, so that Bill Gates can grow, his soybeans to give us, so we don't have meat and we're like serfs, and peasants, and I'm sure they'll have it, and lab-grown meat and all other kind of disgusting stuff. But to do that, they're destroying, order ab chaos, like order out of chaos, so that they can destroy things and they come up with a solution and to build back better. And we're seeing this, and there's also in California, they actually released one of their reservoirs into the ocean to prove climate change. Because some of the people in control there are just, so obsessed with proving this. So we have droughts, we have water being rerouted to Silicon Valley instead of the farmers, stuff like that. And I could go on. Understand that one of these crucial, single vital parts of society could go down, and now, as opposed to when Harry Elmer Barne was writing, let alone even earlier on in civilization. One of these things going wrong, like losing power, a solar flare, for example, would be absolutely ruinous for society as we know it. Anyway, the text will speak for itself, though. It does a great job. We can easily imagine what would happen if basic industries, electric power service, transportation, or food production were entirely disrupted. We now have an economic system which, if it runs well, can do more for man than any earlier one, but it exacts a price for these advantages. It demands relatively efficient control and coordination to operate at all. A dynamo can do much more work than a treadmill, but it needs greater skill and attention, and it is more likely to get out of order if carelessly handled. Our present economic system is in a serious crisis. In the United States, potentially the most prosperous country in the world, the economy almost collapsed between 1922 and 1933, and it has been restored to a semblance of normality only by first aid treatment in the form of lavish expenditure of public funds to bolster private industry and finance, robbing Peter to pay Paul. Now, this is even more true today. I mean, with inflation having rapidly increased just in the past few years. Actually, before COVID, there was and this hasn't been talked about much in the media, the biggest bailout of banks happened in history, and we didn't even hear about it. In fact, no one was allowed. There were gag orders on the media to talk about this for 2 years, so we're just hearing about it now. It's crazy. So back to the text. Candid observers, even if kindly disposed toward Mr. Roosevelt and the New Deal, can hardly maintain that any fundamental institutional changes have been wrought in this system which broke down in 1929 because of basic imperfections. And if it is allowed to collapse again, there is much reason to doubt that such moderate policies will then be effective, even temporarily, in restoring normal operations. And now this is a global issue, because the whole world is intertwined so much that U.S. currency breaks down, pretty much many nations will break down. I mean, they'll be in financial ruin even before we are in the United States. Therefore, it is evident that we face the prospect either of fundamental changes which can make our economic and social system permanently efficient and trustworthy, or of evasive palliatives which will eventually bring acute crisis and collapse. In either case, it means a striking change in present practices, any change which cannot be delayed beyond a decade or so. Obviously, it has gone a little bit more than beyond a decade, but to give him credit, he's been right about a lot of other stuff. It would take a super prophet to tell us today whether we shall take the road to constructive reform or to temporary disintegration. Seems we've taken the road to temporary disintegration. But it requires only passable literacy and ordinary horse sense to discern that we shall take one or the other, and that very soon. The prospective rapidity of the transition in which we now find ourselves is, therefore, the first of the contrasts between ours and any earlier epoch of transition. The second great contrast lies in the sharpness and magnitude of the alternatives which face us, a fact implied in the preceding discussion. In earlier transitional periods, it was a matter of gradual improvement or slow decline. Mankind has never before been faced with a direct and immediate choice between utopia and catastrophe. But such are precisely the alternatives which are offered to Western civilization in our day. If we overhaul our economic system, put our unparalleled mechanical equipment at the service of mankind, and wipe out the menace of war, we can, within a decade or two, move ahead into a condition which will make any of the utopias from Plato to Fourier seem drab, trivial, and uninviting. We could quickly realize Edward Bellamy's dream expressed in Looking Backward, which is a utopian novel. This does not even imply that we must await future mechanical marvels. The technology and natural resources are already at hand. In the United States, we could easily provide a far higher standard of living than has ever been known, and could make it available to the masses with much less than 30 hours of work each week. The same observation is probably true of all other industrialized nations. There could be plenty, security, and an abundance of leisure which would enable us to attain the super-pig vistas of culture envisaged by Plato in his Republic. This is one side of the picture. If we do not rise to our responsibilities and make the most of our unprecedented mechanical equipment, then the whole economic machine is bound to break down within a few years. It has already so far broken down in Europe as to necessitate a well-nigh complete cessation of traditional practices in order to save it from complete collapse. In most of the countries of the Old World, capitalism and democracy as we know them have already disappeared. Now, what might have saved us from that imminent collapse was just the huge advance in technology that we had. But even so, we've just been kicking the can down the road. If the contemporary world continues on the road of evasion and decline, we must face the prospect of collapse through internal weaknesses, even though the Second World War comes to a speedy close. The best we could then hope for would be insecurity, lower standards of living, more unemployment, unrelieved want, misery, and much sheer starvation. To this must be added the continuing danger of devastating warfare and a return to barbarism, for warfare today means wholesale destruction of physical equipment, manpower, and civilized amenities. We have created a new and complex machine age uniquely prepared to serve us or to wreck us. The outcome will depend upon the type of social control which we impose upon our empire of machines. To summarize, we are living in a great transitional age. This transition is bound to be carried through with unprecedented rapidity, and we shall either move into a state of culture far superior to anything hitherto realized by man, or revert to conditions unmatched for mass misery since the early Middle Ages and the era of the 30 Years' War at the close of the medieval period. As James Harvey Robinson has put it, our civilization is likely to perish in as stupid a fashion as the hen in the fable, who starved to death roosting face out on the rim of a bushel basket filled with grain. And that quote is from the Human Comedy, Harper. Startling as such a statement may seem to be, it is one of the few general declarations that can be made today with reasonable assurance of accuracy. Most of us insist upon living in a sort of fool's paradise, maintaining that we are so highly civilized today that we could not possibly revert to barbarism. We admit that the Greeks and Romans lost their civilization, but we smugly contend that no such calamity could happen to us. The historian of culture quickly senses the fallacy in any such self-satisfied argument. In every respect, except science and machinery, the Greeks and Romans were more highly civilized than we are. Our superiority in science and machinery is an asset only if these are used wisely, and for the benefit of mankind. In a scarcity economy, efficient machinery can close more factories, and more speedily than the cruder mechanism of earlier days. And the events since September 1939 suffice to show us what science and machinery can accomplish in the way of the destruction of life and property, when put unrestrainedly at the service of Mars. That is war, and now we have nukes, so... I mean, this was written before Hiroshima, so he didn't yet witness that, so it's been speeding up. And I don't think we have seen science and machinery necessarily going to the good of all humanity. It seems to be going to an elite, while they use some certain science and machinery against us, potentially even for population control, which, if you can guess what I'm getting at, seems to be a kind of genocide right now. In other words, our contemporary science and machinery, if used unwisely, will prove only a more inevitable and a speedier shortcut to oblivion than anything which was at the disposal of the Greeks and Romans. It is obvious, therefore, that we not only can lose our civilization, but can lose it more rapidly than in any period of human culture. And that's important again. It is obvious, therefore, that we can not only lose our civilization, but we can lose it more rapidly than in any earlier period of human culture. Now, why is this important? Because people need to start thinking about this. Particularly, again, with I mean, I don't want to get too much into this, but with what I mentioned in the Suspicious Observers videos, which I highly recommend going on YouTube, if they don't get banned at some point, but we are looking at some problems coming up, and we really need to fix our society and be led to improve our society rather than fall into totalitarianism, because it seems perhaps the only way to manage this for the quote-unquote elite, self-proclaimed at Davos, is for them to impose totalitarian control, starve us, and we go... And it seems we've been taking in that direction since World War II. We have been on the path to totalitarianism. In this day where you can say, like Joe Rogan, can say something, in a country that's supposed to have freedom of speech and be censored, taken off YouTube, and all this other madness. That is just, people need to wake up and see what's going on. Mandates, all this stuff, whatever your position is on that, mandates are not the answer. Totalitarianism is not the answer. And I ask, what can you do to help bring about a freer world? Because we all have to act. We cannot expect our politicians to act for us. We don't have that luxury when politicians actually did what they said, but we have been so reliant upon them that they no longer serve us. They're serving material interests, whoever pays them the most, and that's not us. So I ask again, what can we do to bring about freedom? Because if we turn the other direction, it can be really, really terrible. I mean, back to the 30 years war in Europe, terrible. Just absolutely devastating. Or to take a more current event, the Holodomor, where centralized economies and agriculture resulted in the starvation of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians and other ethnic groups as well. It's just disgusting. So we need to work for freedom. We need to fight for it. Otherwise, when tyranny comes, You have no one to blame. We have no one to blame but ourselves. This is my small way of acting. I also vote with my money. I try to put my money where my mouth is. So, I ask you, please do your part. I know one too many person who has said, oh no, you can't think that way, because no one's actually going to do it. And my response is, well, yeah, that's only because you don't believe in it. And we don't have the luxury of that anymore. We have to fight. Even if we are fighting in the face of inevitable ruin anyway. We still have to fight. Alright, thank you for listening to this, and have a great day. I'm curious what you think of this. Thank you for listening.